Good morning, everybody. My name is Sean Kennedy. I'm the Executive Director of Loyola's Center for Juvenile Law and Policy, which we call CJLP. And I want to welcome you all to day number 2 of our virtual symposium on the holistic representation of crossover youth made possible by the generosity of the Everychild Foundation. Yesterday, we discussed the importance of delinquency teams and dependency teams and educational advocates really working together to achieve true integrated advocacy for their mutual clients. Today, we will start by probing the root causes of delinquency and discuss the most effective ways to address those causes and those problems in the courtroom and the classroom. After that, we'll take up the issue of how the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed and even exacerbated the inherent problems in the legal and educational systems to truly meet the needs of crossover kids. And then we will end with a frank discussion of the lessons learned by all the different professionals working together holistically to represent crossover clients in delinquency, dependency, and educational proceedings. The goal is to work together better to achieve high quality, client-centered, holistic representation of crossover youth. So I'm going to turn it over to the moderator of our first panel on trauma. And Cindy Galvan will be the moderator, and I will let her introduce our panelists and the topic. Cindy, take it away.
Hi, good morning. My name is Cindy. I just want to give the attendees a little, if you have a question or throughout the panel, just go ahead and put it in the Q&A board so we can see it at the end and answer your questions. Okay, so we will start with introductions. So if my panelists can turn their videos on, please. Good morning. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to start off with introductions, and I'll go ahead and pass it over to Ms. Lomelli, and she can start our introductions.
Hi, good morning. My name is Jeanette Lomelli, and I'm a social worker at the Center for Juvenile Law and Policy.
And then we'll pass it over to Dr. Lep.
Good morning. I'm Georgia Lep. I'm an adjunct professor at UCLA in the Luskin School of Public Affairs, but my real job is as the executive director of the UCLA Social Justice Research Partnership, working in the community.
And then I'll pass it over to Dr. Hernandez.
I'm Robert Hernandez. I'm with the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work. I'm on faculty, and my whole area is looking at community trauma and juvenile justice. Glad to be.
And then we'll pass it right over to Dr. Gillis.
Good morning. My name is Arthur Gillis. I am a child and adolescent psychiatrist at UCLA. And outside of that, I also work as a juvenile forensic psychiatrist evaluating youth in the juvenile justice system in LA County.
And then we'll pass it over to Ms. Vazquez now.
Hi, everybody. I'm excited to be here. My name is Ludi. My gender pronouns are she and her. I work at CASA of Los Angeles. It's a nonprofit organization that provides advocacy for young people that are systems involved. And my role is to be the juvenile justice program manager, so we can adapt our advocacy approach to better support young people that are dually involved. Thank you.
And I'll pass it over to Professor Buckingham.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Samantha Buckingham, and I'm the director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic at Loyola and a clinical professor here. Prior to being a professor at Loyola, I was a public defender and also a high school teacher.
Well, thank you so much for your introductions. We are going to go ahead and start moving on to our first question. So I'll start with Professor Buckingham and Dr. Gillis on this question, but is why does trauma matter?
Thank you so much, Cindy. Trauma is so important for us to all understand because it is something that affects so many of the young people in the juvenile justice system. And it's so prevalent, in fact, that we should all be imagining that a young person who we encounter who's in the juvenile justice system has experienced some trauma in their life, particularly when we see young people who are detained. There was one study, in fact, out of Chicago that indicated that kids who are in the detention facilities there, that upwards of 93% of them had experienced trauma, and the most common type of trauma that they had experienced was witnessing an act of violence or experiencing an act of violence themselves that threatened their lives or the lives of someone they knew or loved. So trauma is tremendously important. Would you like me to go through now, Cindy, the adolescent development framework that underlies the Supreme Court decisions?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to do is share my screen, everybody. Give me just a moment. Here we go. So it's important in the legal system, and the Supreme Court has given us this framework for understanding why and how adolescent development applies when we're looking at young people who are involved in the system, why kids are different than adults, and why categorically they're less culpable. So these three main differences were first set out by the Supreme Court in a case called Roper versus Simmons, which outlawed the death penalty for youth. And that case is a little over 15 years ago now, but it's been reaffirmed in other cases. So here's the first difference. Children lack maturity. They do not feel the same sense of responsibility and thus often act impetuously and without careful consideration for the consequences of their actions. And this is because their brain is still growing. And so we know that their prefrontal cortex, the part here that's in green, that part of their brain when they're an adolescent is still developing. It's responsible for decision-making, for weighing costs and benefits, for planning, and importantly, for impulse control. The other part of the brain that's really, really important here is something called the amygdala. It's located in your temporal lobe. And if I were to turn around, it's kind of like, you know, right over here where my glasses are going in behind my ear. That amygdala is responsible for impulses. It's where we have automatic responses associated with fear, like fight or flight, and other emotional responses. So we have these two things going on at the same time, this underdeveloped amygdala that's super impulsive, and the prefrontal cortex that is having a harder time controlling the amygdala. So I'm going to show you a series of photos now. These first came out in Time magazine around the time of the Roper decision, and are the benefit of us having done a series of MRI studies on the life of a brain. And you can see here in this photo of a 4-year-old's brain, red is super immature. And that's the amygdala kind of tucked behind, right, that ear part. And so just take a look at it as we go 9, 13, 15, we still see it's still super red, 17, 21, and still the amygdala is really immature, which means you're having a lot of impulses. And here's a time-lapse image, right, where you have that bright red amygdala. So then the second reason that United States Supreme Court has said kids are different and less culpable than adults. Children are more vulnerable and susceptible to pressure, negative influences, outside pressure. Children are most susceptible to psychological damage and to influence. They have less control over their environment. Nowhere is this more true than of kids in the crossover who are in this crossover category that we're talking about, right? You don't have control over where you live. You don't have control over your home and what you're exposed to in your community. So kids have less control over what they're exposed to. And we know that this is where childhood trauma is situated in this framework provided to us by the Supreme Court, right? And when it comes to the connection of childhood trauma and also how that impacts one's health and life opportunities, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who's a pediatrician and also has been the Surgeon General of California, had said connecting trauma experiences, adverse childhood experiences to the school to prison pipeline, that the odds of having a learning or behavior problem in school were 32 times as high for kids who had adverse childhood experiences. Oh, sorry, I misread that. Score of 4 or more. Sorry, 4 or more ACEs gives you a much higher likelihood of having adverse experiences in school as a result of those childhood traumas. So how common is it? Extremely common. I mentioned this right off the bat, right? A study showing 93% of kids in an urban detention facility in Chicago had experienced at least one trauma in the past year, and more than half of those young people reported witnessing an act of violence as the precipitating trauma. And the final reason that kids are categorically different: the character of a juvenile is not as well formed as that of an adult. The personality traits of juveniles are more transitory, less fixed. And this is where we get to talk about resilience and something called neuroplasticity. Kids are remarkably resilient. They have an ability to grow and change in response to their environment and bounce back from stresses. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to grow and respond. And we have this incredible moment that we really need to harness during adolescence, and we're really still just learning about it. It's this period of time during adolescence from 12 to the mid-20s that is a tremendous opportunity for learning, growth, and transformation. The plasticity of the brain, its ability to change in response to experience, is at its peak, and this should blow your mind. The only other peak in neuroplasticity is from 0 to 3. So I'm going to say that again. Kids from 12 to their mid-20s have the same opportunity for their brain to grow and respond to changes in their environment as a kid from 0 to 3. And that's something we're really just learning about. And it's exciting because we know there's just this tremendous moment of opportunity to interact, especially with kids who've experienced trauma. Thanks, Cindy. I'll pitch it to Dr. Gillis.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was quite fascinating, Professor Buckingham. I just want to add to your framework that you presented so wonderfully about why trauma and how trauma impacts the adolescent brain. So you're right, it's an amazing period of rapid brain development, but that also means it's a vulnerable window for the effects of childhood trauma. So just a little bit of primer on how trauma impacts us normally, and then I'll tie in why that period adolescent is so important. So normally when we're faced with a trauma or threat, we activate our body's stress response system. This is to protect us against threats. We need this system. And so just as Professor Buckingham mentioned, our amygdala detects fear. That's what it's designed to do. And then it signals several areas in our brain to prepare us to respond. So our prefrontal cortex, that green area that was on Professor Buckingham's slide, our hypothalamus, so that we can activate our body's response system and increase our heart rate, our hippocampus, so that we can remember these threats. And then an area kind of in our midbrain, or in the more primitive area of our brain called the locus coeruleus, that kind of gets our sympathetic nervous system going. all of this cascade increases cortisol and other stress hormones to, like I said, increase heart rate, our metabolic rate, our blood pressure, our alertness, things that we would want to have activated where there are threats. So if you were on a safari and, you know, a lion chase, you want these things to come into effect and be online so that you can run. It's a very efficient system. It's a very primitive system. You know, lots of different organisms have some sort of system like this. This is necessary for our survival. However, when there's childhood trauma, when these things are happening chronically and repeatedly during these areas, these times of rapid brain development, there's alteration in these systems, and then it disrupts the body's ability to regulate its stress response. Chronic exposure to trauma impacts learning and memory because of changes in the hippocampus. It impacts social memory and cognition, impacts emotion recognition, empathy, attachment, and impacts reward processing. So some of the interventions that are used in the juvenile justice system don't have the same impact or the intended impact because these systems have been disrupted and things don't work as well as we want them to. Behaviorally, chronically elevated stress hormones can lead to things like hyperarousal, anxiety, aggression, hypervigilance, and stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system. And you'll recognize some of these probably as core symptoms of disorders like PTSD. And I see that a lot in the clients I've evaluated in the juvenile justice system. So it's very important to understand the impact of trauma on the brain and why that adolescent period is so critical. As Professor Buckingham pointed out, it's a challenge, but it also provides opportunities for us to intervene early so that we change the trajectory and allow our youth to have a more normal and healthy development.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge on this topic. And we're going to go down our next question, which is how can the foster system lead to juvenile justice involvement for youth who have experienced trauma? And we'll start with Ms. Lomeli and Ms. Vazquez. No, but panelists, if you have something to add, go ahead, feel free to jump in.
Thank you, Cindy. When I think of this question, I just want to make a note that I'm sure many of us are aware of, that although we're focused on youth who already have an open dependency case, we also know, as Professor Buckingham and Dr. Gillis have shared, that many young people in the juvenile justice system, although they probably don't have a formal open dependency case, have risk factors for dependency involvement. And I think that's just important for us to remember. I think there are several reasons why foster youth cross over into the juvenile justice system. And some of these reasons that we see in our clients are intertwined with other systems. Systems like the group homes, the school system. We talk about the school to prison pipeline. And in that setting, I think, students are funneled into the juvenile justice system because they often experience symptoms of trauma that are misunderstood by school staff, school teachers. Many students also experience learning disabilities. And sometimes we see in our clients, even when they have an IEP and have the support of an education advocate, which is really critical, sometimes they're still misunderstood by other professionals in the education system. And I think we need to look better at how this trauma is manifesting differently and behaviorally, and what we can do to better support them in those settings. Another reason or another example that comes to mind, as I said earlier, is when we see them transition from a group home or even, when they're under the care of a foster family and there is an incident that, or a crisis moment for the young person involved. And what we hear is that in these situations, for safety reasons, sometimes police, law enforcement is called to the scene. And I think that's really, it's a problem when we're responding with law enforcement instead of somebody who's clinically trained to help support the young person in the crisis. I'm not sure if folks are aware of, but I will say that the state of California has recently enacted a FERS system, which is, it stands for Family Urgent Response System. And this is developed to help support specifically foster children who find themselves in these crisis situations. And it sort of serves as a hotline, right? So that the goal is that instead of calling for law enforcement support, they have access to somebody who's trained to help mediate between caregivers or staff at a group home and the young person. So I'm hopeful that I think that is a great step forward. But I think we need that same kind of support for youth in the juvenile justice system, for youth who don't have an open dependency case. If we can recognize that they experience the same traumas, but just because they legally don't have an open dependency case, I think we need to learn to recognize that and extend the same supports to the juvenile justice youth. So those are some of my thoughts, but I'll allow other panelists to chime in.
Hi, I want to jump in. Ms. Lamelli did a really great job at highlighting a lot of the things that, we've identified as risk factors for our young people. And one thing that I really wanted to touch on was, even if our young people, we are assuming that they experience something really traumatic when they enter the system, they're still being traumatized by the system itself. So the system isn't meant to be a caregiver or a caretaker. It functions in a very transactional way, and that's not the kind of system that our young people need to thrive. And so I think that that's one of the biggest challenges because, even if, when they're in the system, they have to deal with inconsistencies of care. They have to deal with multiple placement changes, school discipline, multiple schools that they have to attend because of placement changes. And then that over-reliance on law enforcement really just leads to a lot of harmful outcomes for our young people that aren't necessarily always there for people who are not involved in these systems. And that's one of the things that one of my colleagues at CASA, Jessica, always mentions to me and brings up is that, group homes are institutions and that are not really meant to provide, support for young people. And I think that in the work that I've done, I've noticed that group homes do, while they might be well-intentioned, they do tend to cause a lot of harm to young people. It's not uncommon for young people to have multiple contacts with law enforcement if they're living in a group home. And it's not uncommon for regular teen behaviors, like, questioning rules, getting into arguments with peers or even fights with siblings. I think all of us, if we had a sibling, have gotten into a fight with a sibling. And imagine just living in a group home facility where a lot of young people are forced to, live in a small space, interact, and, just live and have to be together all the time. That can be a very stressful situation. And so then if they engage in these regular teen behaviors, a lot of times they're criminalized for doing these things. And it's not really giving young people a fair opportunity to really be able to grow and learn from their experiences, because it's, calling law enforcement doesn't necessarily lead to a restorative approach. And that's really what we want our young people to have access to. And another thing that I really wanted to touch on was the change in placement often leads to a change in schools. And that can be really harmful for our young people because if they're used to a certain environment, they have close connections to their teachers, they have close connections to their peers. And if there's a lot of instability, like in terms of their placement, maybe that's the only place that young people have that's like a consistent place for them. And I think that when our young people are dealing with these systems, that can be something that's really at high risk for being taken away from them. And, we already know that when young people change schools, they lose months in terms of their education. I think studies found that when young people change their schools, they lose 4 to 6 months. That's half of a school year. So our young people are really not being given the opportunity to necessarily have one stable environment where they can thrive. And we know that school acts as a buffer against, involvement in the juvenile justice system or, many other things. And so I think that that's one thing that, we really need to improve on, is like making sure that people are aware of school of origin, making sure that we advocate for young people to remain in those placements and just try to have as much consistency as possible. And another thing that I did want to point out is I talked about how the system itself can be very traumatizing. And it just makes me think a lot about the 241.1 MDT process. Like for our young people in the dependency system, when they get into trouble and there's a likelihood that they'll be involved in two systems, the 241.1 protocol comes into place, and there's an assessment of the young person's history. And we've noticed a lot in the work that we do at CASA is that at these MDTs, while we would love for, the priority would be to be strength-based and talk about the youth's strengths and speak to the youth's, what the youth has done in terms of progress. And I think Professor Kennedy hit on this a lot yesterday. We usually see the opposite, where a lot of people are highlighting the young person's, challenges, the fights that they've had at the group home, the regular team behaviors of like challenging authority. All of those things are brought to the table, and unfortunately, like that's what ends up in these reports. And so you end up getting, a picture of this young person that, if you actually knew them, you'd be like, this is not this young person. This report does not highlight who this person is as a whole. It just highlights the deficits. And I think that we really need to do a better job at being more strength-based instead of deficit-based in our systems. So those are some of my thoughts.
I want to jump in here too, because we're talking about what systems do. And I just want to say there are systems that don't do things. We keep talking about interventions here. And sometimes, sadly, the child welfare system is missing in action. There is system failure. They're not there. And oftentimes youth who would be more effectively served in whatever ways by the child welfare system, because and let's face it, it's a cliche now, they've fallen through the cracks. Then the first system they come into contact with is the juvenile justice system. And this is not the place for them. The other thing, and this is unrelated, and I love what everybody is bringing up. Let us not forget that there are mental health issues and substance misuse issues where we have kids that are self-medicating because of trauma, along with normal adolescent behavior, along with the brain is developing. All this is going on at once, and there is really not understanding and systems not addressing this as effectively as they need to. So we've got this whole issue of sometimes the systems are missing in action, and you've got a kid that winds up in a probation hall who's got trauma, substance misuse, mental health issues, and it's a wonder they survive at all. And I absolutely love what Ludovina, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, having been called Jorja too many times. I think about these kids and their resilience. Spoiler alert, we're going to talk about resilience a little later on. And it's just what Ludovina said. We need to portray these kids in their strengths, because what they go through and what they encounter, I challenge anyone who's watching or listening or sitting on this panel. I could not have done it. I'm a weakling. I could not have faced what these youth face and what they endure and what they prevail over.
Thank you so much. You just hear the passion in your voice when you talk about this, and it's great that we have people, folks that are out there, serving this youth. Okay, we're going to move on to the next question, which is: once foster youth have contact with law enforcement, how can we avoid further punishment, right? And then I'll have Dr. Hernandez, Professor Kennedy, Professor Buckingham, Ms. Vazquez talk a little bit more about this issue. So Dr. Hernandez, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. I just want to say, we also have to look at, I'm speaking as a social worker by training. I was just having this discussion with our dean. We also have to look at our child welfare system that hasn't fared well with communities of color, and how the structural system itself has to be called out, right? And that's something we have to reckon with. And I know oftentimes we refer to law enforcement, but we also have a piece in that as well. And as they filter through the child welfare system, and again, we hear the school to prison pipeline. There's something I've been framing with my colleagues and others, the whole trauma to prison pipeline, right? We're literally incarcerating our youth's trauma right from the gate. And it's interesting when we start to talk about this process, how can we intervene? When can we intervene? And again, oftentimes it's not rocket science, and we know this, that the most vital component is developing strong rapport, creating safe space. It's what we call now, like, beyond the stopping of the hurt and harm, let's get to structural well-being, those creating safe spaces, environment of compassion, kinship, and trust. We need to focus on the healing and learning of the person rather than controlling or modifying the behaviors. I mean, oftentimes, what do we see that often amplifies the conflict? And that's where we see the legal system really getting really intertwined and taking control. And once the legal system takes control, that's it. And then I know we're going to talk about the whole formation of gangs. I mean, studies indicate, and Dr. Leep knows this well than anyone, once a youth engages with the criminal justice system, gang alliance strengthens by 88%. So are we making this issue? Are we manufacturing this issue? And then we need to respond, we need to react. So again, how do we, on the front end, proactively create these safe spaces? And really, there's something I will highlight in a second. The cultural piece is so key. And there's something I always like to focus on, and it's called cultural trauma. Cultural trauma. And that's a piece I want to explore a little bit later, because it relates in terms of it's viewed so differently from psychological and physical trauma, as it's more likely to result in a dramatic loss of identity. And that's key. When you don't have a strong sense of self, that's when you get into that area of gang formation. So I'll leave it there, and I'll defer to my colleagues. Thank you.
Professor Kennedy?
Thank you. So almost every case that I get from CLC is a young teenage boy with gang involvement and a gun. And everything Dr. Hernandez says, just makes so much sense to me. In the juvenile justice system, there's like a real dynamic that I think of as gang exceptionalism, treating kids with gang involvement as different from everyone else. They're supposed to go to the compound in Sylmar, which is the most penitentiary-like part of juvenile hall. Every report references their gang involvement and calls them gang entrenched. And I don't have the language that Dr. Hernandez does, but he's so right. It's about not having an identity. When all everyone does is talk about your gang involvement all the time, it must be really hard to think of yourself as something other than a member of a gang. And so I think the best thing that juvenile justice lawyers and their teams can do is to not buy into that gang exceptionalism. Look at that young client as a young person in need and try to address the root causes that brought them to the gang. And almost always, as Jorja was saying, it's a humbling experience of trauma, neglect, abuse. Every one of my gang clients, when I start to look into the social history, I'm like, oh my God, how are you on the earth? You know, how do you do this? And so I think we need to reject the police probation gang narrative of punitive punishment. It's okay to send them to prison-like facilities because they're, quote, gangbangers, unquote, and emphasize heavily treatment and education, particularly from community-based organizations that are not affiliated with the police or probation, who understand all too well why young teens gravitate towards gangs, and support and support and support. And there'll be many failures along the way, and not judge it and understand it's part of a process. I had a client who graduated from high school who was so-called entrenched, and it took a village. But when he graduated from high school, he invited me and the student who worked on his case to his graduation, and the beaming pride that exuded from him in his a graduation gown was literally amazing. And he has not offended again. So I just think that we have to really avoid the system, the criminal justice system's use of gangbanger mentality as if they're different, and treat them like the kids they are.
Amen. Cindy, I'm going to pick up there, I think, right? So how do we avoid further punishment for people who have experienced trauma? And I think I'm going to be picking up on a lot of what Dr. Hernandez and Professor Kennedy just said. Here's how we need to respond. When we have a child who presents themselves as having done something, like let's say you brought a weapon to school, or let's say you've gotten into a fight and you have beaten somebody up, and we're like, why would you do that? We need to be asking, what happened? That's the trauma-informed response. What happened? We need to be curious, we need to be caring, we need to be interested, and we need to get to the root, right? We talked about at the very beginning how common trauma is, and how common it is to have that experience of having witnessed, for instance, an act of violence. Someone who witnesses an act of violence, and this is something I have seen repeatedly in my career, right? You witness the act of violence, you are now scared yourself, and you're going to do something to try and protect yourself. That may be affiliating with a group of people who we label as a gang, because they're going to protect you. That may be bringing a weapon with you when you ride the bus. And we need to find out, what's that underlying thing? What happened that made you feel unsafe? And what can we do? And here's something I learned from Dr. Lep. I love this phrase. I'm using it all the time. If you take something away, you've got to add something. If you take away the gang, if you take away something that's providing a sense of security, you've got to add something else. And, to what Sean was saying, it should be in the community, because incarceration itself is traumatic. In the child welfare system, we are likely to see kids removed from their family along racial lines. As so much more likely to happen to a kid of color, even for the same circumstances that a white child in a white family might present. And the same happens in the juvenile justice system. And it's even worse when you've got a kid who's a kid of color, who's a kid who's been involved in the dependency system. They're so much more likely to be removed from their family and incarcerated. And to a child, to be removed from their community, their family, it feels like punishment. Always, right? And when you see that applied in a racially disparate way, it also is undermining of your faith in the fairness of our society, that people like me are going to experience this and others aren't. And that doesn't do what we want to do to promote people behaving in a pro-social, community-oriented way in the future. So I say, get to the root of the problem in a caring way by finding out what actually happened, and then adding the supports.
I believe it's my turn. Okay. I think everybody made really great points, because like the root, really, we need to address that, because there is a need that was not met for this young person, and our community failed them by not providing them with that need. It's our responsibility. We always try to pin it on the young person, but it's like, think about the systems we've set in place. Think about the community and the way that it is, how we disproportionately provide more funding for white neighborhoods as opposed to like Black and brown neighborhoods. We are causing this trauma. And so we need to do something to address this disproportionality, because it's not just on them. And I think that we need to be able to provide restorative practices for our young people so that they themselves can heal. Because I think that when, you know, a crime is committed, a lot of times, you know, we forget about the young person who actually did the harm or allegedly committed the harm. That experience is very traumatic for them as well. There have been many young people that I've advocated for, and that haunts them. Like the fact that they did that haunts them. And I think that we need to have more empathy and more supportive services, and be able to provide them with support, because you know, there's a reason why all of these situations arose, and this happened to this young person. So I think we need to extend grace and remember that they are not just the worst thing that they've ever done. None of us are. And I think that we need to look at young people with that lens as well.
I also just want to underscore what Sean said, or Mr. Kennedy, what Sean said about exceptionalism, because I've had a belly full of it working with gang members. And I think each and every one of us, literally all of you in law school, everybody on the webinar, we've got a duty to educate the public that anyone is capable of being a gang member. And I always love to say, I was the worst acting out teenager, adolescent you can imagine. I'm an overachiever, and I overachieved at adolescent acting out. But I was from a blue collar Anglo family, and my parents, first they sent me to the priest, great idea. Then they finally sent me to a counselor. If I had been born in Watts, I'd be a shot caller. There's not a doubt in my mind. And I say this to people and they always go, oh, no, Georgia, no. Yes, anyone here would have been driven, wanted to, attracted, intimidated enough to join a gang. Wake up. We just had one of the worst gangsters leading the country for a while. And I'm not overstating it. And I'm sorry if I offend anyone's politics. But here's the deal. It's not exceptionalism. It's normalization. This could happen to anyone. You imagine yourself born in Pacoima, born in Boyle, born in Watts, with strengths, but without resources. What would you do? And I think we've got a duty not only to think about our youth, but parallel to working with them, to educating the public about what alleged gang membership means. It doesn't mean the compound at Sylmar. It means it could happen to any of us. Okay, that's the end of my sermon. Okay.
I think that's a great segue into the next question, Dr. Leap. So, Dr. Gillis, did you have something to add?
I did really quickly. It was really inspiring. So I want to highlight what Dr. Jorja said. You know, zip codes do determine outcomes and opportunities. Kids don't determine where they're born. And so we have to take that into account. The second point I want to highlight is we have to take into account, we can't be blind to the historical context of forced family separation in Black and brown communities so that our interventions don't perpetuate more cultural trauma. We have to think about those things. We cannot be blind to those.
Thank you, Dr. Gillis. So the next question is, what kinds of unique circumstances should advocates be aware of and learn to address for foster youth? So this question, I'll have Professor Kennedy, Dr. Hernandez, and Dr. Lep answer. And we can go ahead and start off with Professor Kennedy. Thank you.
When I was a rookie public defender, I encountered the power of the police gang narrative quickly. And the police gang narrative is that young people choose to become members of gangs to heighten their power and line their pocketbooks. And they do everything on gang turf to enhance their reputation for viciousness and the gang status, and intimidate and terrorize the communities who live in gang turf, so they won't be witnesses against the gang members and will pay taxes and assent to a host of evil and violent conduct. My reaction to that was to run from gang membership, to deny it, to be afraid of it, and let the police own it, and simply try to say my client is not a gang member. Well, if that's a good defense, that's a good defense. But often the evidence of gang membership was so strong that it was really no defense at all. And so one of the unique things I think we have to focus on in representing crossover youth, who in my experience gravitate towards gangs to replace families that they don't have, is to understand it's real, recontextualize it, and talk about a defense gang narrative in which young people are pushed or forced into gangs because they are in such dire circumstances. They're in abusive homes. I mean, all my clients who join gangs, parents are out of the home because of addiction, and the whole family, the kid and his younger siblings have no food, and the gang feeds them. And I have a client now who calls the OG and his girlfriend mom and dad, because he simply has never experienced a loving parent the way he has experienced it from the OG and his girlfriend. And so unless we understand that we need our own true narrative about gang involvement and use it as mitigation and contextualize it and use it in plea bargaining and do social histories in evaluating competence, in arguing for dispositions, in seeking non-incarceration like solutions, we'll never get there, because the police gang narrative rolls over everyone in the courtroom, and everyone bonds together, judging the kid who chose to be in a gang and do such evil things. And everyone feels good about putting that kid in DJJ or wherever it will be now. And I think a new gang narrative is essential in crossover representation.
Mr. Kennedy, I'm like, where have you been? We need to have coffee. I'm like, man, I'm ready to go over there right now. But I just want to say thank you. And I really appreciate what you're saying. And just a little thing, I want to go back to Dr. Lep. You know, anyone here could be considered gang members, right? And I'll say this. We have two of the largest represented gangs on this website, on this webinar, USC, UCLA. Institutional gangbanging, we got our signs, we got our colors. So activity I go through with my students over there. So we do have that institutional gangbanging, right? So, you know, there's one thing that's missing when we talk about in this discourse, right? And again, I want to go back to culture. What is culture? An organized response to human needs: food, safety, security, love, belonging, culture, right? And when we talk about trauma, we talk about this whole trauma to prison pipeline. A lot of our marginalized youth in this setting, crossover youth, foster care youth, dual status youth, have an unspoken language that centers around pain, hurts, wounds, we now refer to as trauma. And just a quick example, say I'm a youth going into a school, don't know the language, don't know the people, don't fit in, been exposed to neglect, harm throughout childhood. And somehow, some way, I connect with an individual. I don't know what it is. we don't know our histories, but somehow we gravitate through our pain. It's an unspoken language that we connect through the pain and our experiences. We don't even have to mention them, we connect. And it's that connection where those adaptations occur and give rise to a subculture, a counterculture, if we will, found in gangs. Youth groups or groupings is a form of healthy development. When we talk about youth development, youth grouping is a form of healthy development. In this case, it's a form of survival. Now we refer to it as resilience. Resilience is survival skills. Let's be real. Now this reactive emergence of these subcultures or countercultures develop when people, in this case, marginalized foster youth, feel they do not fit into the dominant culture for that stated society. So again, it usually develops around racial tensions, environmental, social, political, and even historical differences. In this context, westernized school context. So what's created is a distinctive normative set of beliefs, values, attitudes, behavioral habits that conflict with that of the larger dominant culture. Again, survival. Survival to what we would say ascribe meaning to their experiences, give meaning to what they've endured. And I bring it back to culture. We got to understand culture is not static. It's not static. It evolves from a dynamic, multi-leveled interaction between individuals and their environment, or what we refer to their ecological environment. And another thing, again, going back to what you mentioned, Mr. Kennedy, the criminal street gang label and the criminalization of youth, largely of color, through what? Vague legal categorization of a gang that is used to target and over-police and prosecute communities of color. And how did this come about? Through criminogenic reactions that grew from moral panic. We all know about the super predator, agenda motivated by racial and ethnic stereotypes, resulting in discriminatory policies, negative perceptions, and mass incarceration of youth of color. Lastly, media hyper-focus and labeling of gangs demonizes youth of color and distracts researchers and society as a whole from uncovering and underlining the root causes of youth violence and the bigger picture. So I'll yield to my colleagues. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's my turn, but I got to reinforce what Dr. Hernandez said, but I'm going to tell you right now, you want to see gangbanging, watch academics, not just USC and UCLA, because they're the worst. I would rather be with an OG any day than some of my colleagues, and I'll say it, okay? All right, so let me tell you about when I was a young and stupid social worker in Watts. And I originally worked as a child welfare, for child welfare with abused kids. And I literally couldn't take it. I told you I was a weakling. I am a weakling. And instead of kids who had been abused sexually and physically, I moved on to gang members. Now, ironically, they all turned out to have been abused. Even young men who did not want to talk about being sexually abused. And remember this, because we've got to reframe this. What I discovered about the kids that had been in the child welfare system who moved to gangs, they moved to gangs or went to gangs for all the reasons we're well aware of. It was a family. They were more effective caretakers than the child welfare system. There was a downside. You might not live long, you might get incarcerated, but the gang had your back. Your homies had your back. You were taken care of. You were given an identity. You were given a sense of family. Here's the other piece of the narrative we need to reframe. kids who joined gangs were expressing their rage, their anger, their impotence, their insecurity about having been abused. I gravitated to them as a young social worker because I saw they were expressing their feelings, maybe not in a pro-social way, maybe not in the appropriate, I'm upset way, but in a way that they were aware somehow and could name and could sort of act out what was happening to them. And right there, it's a strength. We need to change the narrative from law enforcement. We need to change the narrative about what these youth promise. We have a range of research that shows, number one, when kids act out, they have a better chance of drawing attention to themselves and getting the help they need, allegedly, not always when they're Black youth and youth of color, but we'll set that to the side. The other thing is gang membership is transitory. We act like it's a life sentence, and that is bullshit. And that's an academic term. People most often age out of gangs. As they go into their 20s, as they have children, as they see that the landscape is not so promising for OGs, as they're locked up and don't want the second strike, the third strike, life imprisonment, as they see one of their homies killed, they age out of gangs. They don't want to do it anymore. And that's part of the narrative that never gets discussed. There's two other points I want to make. Number one, gangs are not monolithic. There is not the gang. And I think it's really important that we understand gangs differ and gang membership differs. There's wannabes, there's associates. Not everybody is a hardcore gang member. And law enforcement loves to take the big brush and paint them all as hardcore. They're going to get you. They're going to come to your house in the middle of the night. They're going to rape your women. They're going to take your computers or whatever, I don't know, or your jewelry. No, most gang members are scared, traumatized youth who don't know what to do and affiliate with gangs because they've got nowhere else to go. Not all gangs and not all gang membership is the same. The other thing is, all right, we're an hour into this and no one has said anything specifically, including me, no one has said specifically anything about women. And girls and women require attention, understanding, and their own narratives, plural. They're sometimes associated with gangs. They're sometimes active gang members. They're sometimes traumatized, trafficked young women. And by the way, they are sometimes detained for nothing worse than acting out or being a witness to violence. So we've got to understand not only and by the way, don't even get me started on LGBTQ youth who may or may not be gang affiliated for protection. So we've got to understand gangs are not monolithic and the narrative is not monolithic. We have tons of educating to do. And by the way, the other thing is I am sick and tired of seeing law enforcement touted as the experts. And I've got to give Sean Kennedy a shout out because he's empowered me, and we need to go forth and empower and train others, because we've got to reframe the narrative, not only as we talk about the amazing work that Everychild does, framing the agencies funding the agencies that do this work. We've got to reframe the narrative. We've got to take back the narrative in hearings, in court, in sentencing, in appeals, because every single time someone with a uniform and a mustache, even women, no, not really. Okay. Sometimes someone with a uniform gets up there and they're the authority. Quit it. We've got to have social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists like Dr. Gillis. I will put Dr. Gillis up against any law enforcement officer I know. So call on the experts, reframe the narrative. Let's take this back, because I'm sick of everybody going, oh, well, the cops said it. Well, they said it. Oh, they've got to. No. And I know of what I speak. Many of you know this about me, but to be truly transparent, I'm married to a retired LAPD deputy chief, or as we like to say at our house, he's in recovery. So I am take back the narrative 24/7, and we've got to do this and put it out there all the time in every context. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much. I just want to open it up to any panelists that want to add to the conversation. Go ahead, Professor Buckingham.
Thanks. I was just thinking about what Dr. Leap just said about young women, and I think that it's so important because when it comes to trauma, girls manifest trauma differently than boys. And I also meant to say, and this is why I said Dr. Gillis earlier, I'd like Dr. Gillis also to maybe talk a little bit about that and what some of the ways are. Like, I know as an advocate, I'm on the lookout for, things that girls do, like self-harm more so than boys do, to give me an indication that perhaps there's trauma going on there, but the kinds of trauma that they experience are also different, right? Like there's a higher likelihood of sexual abuse trauma and specific issues that flow from that. So took something Dr. Leap said and now want to kick it over to Dr. Gillis, if I may, to talk a little bit more about this issue of girls and the trauma they experience more specifically.
Thanks so much, Professor Buckingham and Dr. Leap. Yes, so girls are more likely to experience sexual abuse, unfortunately. And in addition to all the other pipelines we've talked about, and this is a part of the trauma to prison pipeline, specifically for girls, there's a sex abuse to prison pipeline, because the response to trauma, to the sexual abuse, gets criminalized, gets seen in this light. The narrative is determined by the courts, by prosecution, and instead of treatment, these girls get shuttered into the juvenile justice system. Girls obviously, at more risk of being trafficked. And I'll say some of the most dysregulated youth that are in need of the most treatment I see are the girls. They don't even want to talk when I come in. They're irritable. They'll, if you want to see it this way, hostile. That's not how I see it, but they can be seen as hostile. And these are the most hurt little human beings that weren't protected and are now in a system where they're not getting the protections they need, not accessing the treatment they need, but very absolutely can be treated. There are interventions that could be had if we could just see the behaviors, the root of the cause of the behaviors as trauma. And as you mentioned, Professor Buckingham, the first question is, what happened? What happened? And also to understand that when a child does not want to talk to you about what happened, they are not being resistant. They are maybe not trying to re-traumatize themselves, and that is protective. And that there are other ways to get the information you need about what happened than to try to force it out of this child. And if they won't talk, they're being uncooperative. It can manifest in school as well. And so it also can lead them through the school to prison pipeline because they're suddenly acting out. That's not trip to the principal, that's trip to the school counselor, that is interventions. But if they're in the juvenile justice system and I interface with them, it's gonna be, this is what happened, this is what they need, and not all this punishment. We should not be punishing trauma and sexual abuse and things like that. I could go on about it. I'm gonna stop right there, but that's my perspective on the sex abuse to prison pipeline.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gillis. And, we're just gonna try to end on a hopeful note. We talk a lot and it's, it takes a toll on all of us. So we're gonna go into the topic of, resiliency, and maybe we can have one or two panelists, talk about what practices can those working with youth implement that help build resiliency in them.
Can I kick off here to say resilience is the ability to bounce back, and there are things we can specifically do to promote resilience. And I think part of what's important is to talk about resilience of the young person, but also think about resilience of their family. And we should be speaking with people in ways that respect them and give them credit for their strengths in every interaction we have, whether it's lawyers with clients and family members, or it's the judge in the courtroom, or a prosecutor in the courtroom, or a probation officer in the courtroom, in a report they're writing, in a communication with a young person or their family. People respond when they get credit for the things that they're doing well. They're more open to the criticism or suggestion that there are some things they can do better when we give them credit for the positive things that they're doing. And one of the massive failures of the system I see is that probation writes in such a way that kids constantly feel undermined. And because they don't feel like they're getting credit for the things they've done well, these reports and the narratives are only about what they've done wrong and holding them accountable for the things that they've done wrong. And it's hard to hold somebody accountable for what they've done wrong if you don't give them credit for what they're doing right.
If I could just expand on that really quickly. Just the way you started it off earlier, I remember when I would go and do school assessments, McClay Middle School out in Pacoima, and I remember I'd show up, and from the dean of discipline to the campus cop to the principal, get this kid out of here. They're just out of control. And when they're off campus, the school is so nice and peaceful. And I'm just like, I need to meet this kid. He must have incredible leadership skills. I'm like, wow, to be able to affect the whole culture of a campus. And I'm like, wow. So really building off those strengths, continuing to support those developmental assets. And one of the biggest things is emotional intelligence too, in your treatment planning. I mean, what do we know? Emotional intelligence is the non-cognitive capabilities of competencies and skills needed to cope with life stressors and situations. So that's a key component that I always bring up. Incorporate that into your assessment plans, building resiliency and those developmental assets, and that positive youth development is so, so key. So thank you.
I also think that we need to look at certain behaviors that are labeled criminal and see what underlies them that's a strength. It's a paradox. One of the most brilliant people I know was a major drug dealer and distributor for a gang. He's brilliant. If he was a nice white kid from Brentwood or Pasadena, he'd have gotten an MBA. Instead, he ascended up the gang hierarchy. After child welfare, after juvenile justice, after adult incarceration, he became a transnational drug distributor. Now, this is a strength. And someone may say, oh my God, the lives he's ruined. I am not discounting that, but I am saying his mathematical abilities, his organizational abilities, his resilience, as Professor Buckingham defined it, we've got to look beyond the surface and redefine strengths. Just like a young woman who survives sexual abuse and is trafficked, I know a young woman, she survived sexual abuse, she was trafficked, and she began trafficking young women. That's a horrific description. But underneath this all, she had leadership skills. I don't know how else to say it. We have to overcome our own biases and understand the trajectory that people take out of their resilience and out of their strengths to make the decisions they do.
I just wanted to add on to what my colleagues were saying is like, we all have the power to reframe this narrative. Whenever we go to school meetings, whenever we go to court, whenever like for our CASA volunteers, whenever they submit court reports, I tell them, you have the ability to reframe the narrative. If everybody is saying something negative, just like Dr. Lep said, find how this is a strength. Because just like Dr. Hernandez said, if this young person has that much power and influence over a whole school, think about the strength that they would have if they were put in a position where they could thrive. And that's what I always tell my volunteers and my colleagues is reframe the narrative, because there's more to this person than what other people are describing.
Thank you so much for all the knowledge, the insight, and being able to be part of this panel. But right now we're going to have 10 minutes for Q&A, and I know we do have some questions on the chat, so let me read the first one. Compassion fatigue, or the cost of caring, is a real, lived, and adverse consequence of listening in an ongoing way to stories of persons negotiating current and past traumas. How do each of you take care of yourself and keep yourself engaged, strong, given the work in which all of you are engaged in? And then, Jeanette, do you mind answering this?
Sure, I can start with that. Thank you for that question. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about and I care a lot about because it's really real. And I'll say for myself, doing this work, it's hard, it's heavy work. And it requires a lot of self-care, and it's difficult. One thing that, I'll say is sometimes we know that a lot of folks in this profession come into this profession because we want to make a difference, but also because maybe we've experienced some of the things that we see in our clients or in these communities. I know that's true for myself. And I was once told that because of my experience, it would be difficult for me to do this work. And, I challenge that. And I hope that others who are listening are empowered to challenge that notion too, because we have empathy to be able to connect with our clients and to really see the strengths that they have. So I say, with that, it's important to take care of yourself. And some of the things that I do that help me is talk to my colleagues. It's always important to have that support from one another. Also take care of yourself in other ways. Spend time with family, do things that empower you, that remind you of why you're doing this work. And also that it's okay sometimes to take a pause to reset yourself, because we also need to refuel and sometimes take a pause so that we can come back stronger. One of the things that I love is that through the program here at CJLP is that we have the opportunity to talk to law students about these issues, about vicarious trauma, about self-care and burnout, because it's essential to be able to continue this work. We need to stay empowered to empower our young people. And the last thing that I'll say, just to touch on the resiliency topic a little bit, is to put everything that others have said into context. One thing that I do with all of my clients is I ask them if they know what resiliency means, and none of them do. And so I get to introduce that language to them and tell them what it means. And I say, now when somebody will ask you, what are your strengths? You can say, I'm resilient. So part of changing the narrative, which is a topic that we've all discussed here, includes giving that language to our young people and have them reiterate that so that they can start to introduce themselves and identify themselves in a new way.
Thank you so much. And if you have another question, we have, what are some effective ways to work with the police/probation system to get them better informed on these issues? And I'll leave it up to any of the panelists that want to answer this one.
Okay, you hear that silence? Sometimes I think we don't know what to do. But I think the most, look, they don't work. They're not effective. And by the way, there are noble people in both of these institutions. There are noble people in both of these agencies. There are people who care about children. And here's the other thing. There are people who are traumatized, who were traumatized as children in both of these sort of entities, institutions. Once again, they're not monolithic. They're just like gangs. They're not all the same. We have got to figure out a way other than convenings to work with these individuals, to educate these individuals, to bring them into our world. And that means connecting to them, relating to them, interacting with them, and getting coffee with them, sitting down with them, doing things together with them, and also creating situations, multidisciplinary teams, overused words. We've got to have more connection. We've got to educate each other. I speak from deep, deep personal experience. The other thing is we've got to identify the good guys, male, female, trans, LGBTQ, whoever. And by the way, they're in probation and they're in law enforcement. They're hiding, but they're there. We have to identify them. We have to share their names. We have to support them. We have to work with them. We know who's good. We know who's no good. And we have to make an effort to draw out those who share our frame of thinking, because they are there, but they're hiding. And we need to draw them out, and we need to make alliances with them while also supporting the work of oversight to get rid of the bad individuals, the actors in probation and law enforcement that are not noble, that are destructive. So I think we've got to have oversight, and we've got to build relationships. We've got to educate them. And by the way, a once a year convening is absolutely positively not going to do it.
I couldn't agree more, Dr. Leap. And I've had the privilege of being able to teach law enforcement and probation officers who are, opting into, wanting to be in leadership positions and opting into programs where, they want a higher degree, they want to learn more. And in those settings, granted, it's a self-selected group, right? But in those settings, I have been extremely impressed. I went into those, those experiences a little bit nervous, like, what are they going to think about me, defense attorney, lawyer lady, right? And I have seen people who are saying they're really blown away by the adolescent development framework and by learning more about the psychology, and they can't believe that they haven't received training on this before. And they're also really, really struggling with, how do you apply this to kids who are doing really serious offenses? Like, what do we do to keep the community safe? And so I think we do have to engage in those big questions, because it's almost like having a victim offender restorative justice mediation. We may have very different experiences, but if we don't all come together and coalesce around our shared values to have a safe society where everyone's respected, we're not gonna move the ball forward. So I think there have to be opportunities for engagement, and sometimes that means pushing ourselves. Like, maybe there's something I would rather do than have a conversation with somebody who I see as, diametrically opposed to me in other settings. But doing it as much as you can, and seeing that as a part of your work as well, I think has the capability of moving the ball forward on a larger level.
Thank you. We're going to have one more question, and then we will conclude the panel. And one of them is, can you speak a bit on the trend among the courts and among prosecutors to respond to a child's trauma? Are they open to understanding the principles you've all set forth today, and how has it impacted their work?
I think there's been a real big change as a result of Gascon being elected as the district attorney, and now having directives that tell them they have to take trauma into account. So what I've found is that there's more responsiveness and more curiosity, but there's this individual actors are still feeling like, I don't know exactly how to account for trauma. I know I'm supposed to, but I don't know exactly how to do it here. And so I think there's an eagerness to learn that I have experienced, but not a lot of experience that they've had on how to do it and wanting to follow, the directives, but it's been a pretty radical sea change. And so that, granted, that's a very small subset of experiences that I've had, and everything can be really different when you're coming in also, from the Center for Juvenile Law and Policy, because of the place that we operate in the community as both practitioners and also policy leaders and thinkers in this area, and being separate and apart from the court system. So my experience may not be the same as everyone else's.
I think there's a lot of resistance, even within Gascon's own office, and not a lot of great facility with these issues. And so it's incumbent on defense counsel to bring to the court the experts we're hearing on this panel today, to bring social histories and mental health expert information, independent gang experts who recontextualize gang membership, and use it all to support the policies that exist and have someone actually deal with untreated trauma and realistic assessments of why young people are in gangs. So I think we need to educate them through high quality, client-centered representation with defense experts, and not simply rely on the narratives put forth by probation.
Thank you so much. So we are concluding the trauma panel. I want to thank all the panelists here today. You took up this morning to be here today, and again, also to the attendees, thank you so much for showing up to this panel. And I'll pass it over to Professor Kennedy.
Yes, so we're going to take a 10-minute break so people can check email or get coffee. We'll reassemble at 10:35 to hear different efforts to address the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on our crossover clients and other youth who are detained. So we'll see you in 10 minutes. Thank you.